where you were when you heard about, or at least had access to more information about the recent Supreme Court ruling. So the first one being the ruling related to affirmative action.
Yeah, I was on vacation. I was in Kansas City. And I think you sent me a text message. And then I said to my niece who I was visiting, I have to see what this is because Miriam just sent a text message that sounds pretty upset. And so that would have been before the somewhere around the July 4th weekend.
So when you at least started to, and I'm not sure if you read, any of the sort of supplemental documents, including, the official rulings, but what were your reactions hearing or reading about the official ruling?
I have not finished reading it in detail, but it wasn't a surprise to me because I actually expected that it would happen
Mhm.
because it was consistent with what they had done for all of the rulings that had something to do with threatening the power and privilege of white heterosexual men. So for me, it was just a matter of what's on the docket.
Mhm.
Whatever is on the docket they're going to rule in it in a way that favors white heterosexual male privilege. So that was not surprising to me. I was intrigued by the dynamics of the decision because the people who opposed it were marginalized women. So women of color or Jewish women or a Jewish woman. Uh, the people who were in favor of it, interestingly, at least three of them were people who should have been on the other side, given the history of their ancestors in the country. Um, Certainly, Thomas should have been on the other side. The Amy, whatever her name is, should have been on the other side, given the threat to women's rights that's already occurred. And then the Italian judge, who I always want to call Scalia, but he's not Scalia. I never remember his name, but he should have been on the other side too, given the history of racism against Italians in the United States, with respect to particularly in the South. And so I make of that in an effort to get access, to maintain access to power, the three of them voted in a way that they should not have voted, given the history of their ancestors.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think there have been, or at least I've watched some commentary of folks, certainly around Clarence Thomas. I think for many people, that's the more obvious. Clarence Thomas being a Black identified man, being the more obvious, where folks are sort of questioning and critiquing and criticizing. But I can appreciate, as you said, looking at the identities of other folks too, in terms of or relative to the ruling. I am curious how your understanding. You and I have had conversations about the Constitution. We've had conversations certainly about race relations, but how are you making sense of this ruling, as well as the affirmative action ruling, as well as the one there afterwards in 2023? So can we help folks understand, as we think about whether that's sort of race and power and privilege, what's your take on the current rulings given the Supreme Court?
The history of race in the United States is that we've never explicitly talked about it.
Okay.
And so from the beginning of the founding of the United States, if you look at the Constitution, it does not talk about racial groups. It talks about, it implies Black people because it talks about conditions of slavery, but it doesn't mention Black people. The only group it mentions are American Indians. And it mentions them as property, so it does not really think about them as people. It mentions enslaved entities as property. And so there's not a history of talking about race directly. If you follow the amendments to the Constitution that were intended to provide people, say, rights to Black people, rights to women, rights to religious groups, they don't actually explicitly mention anything about race. They don't explicitly mention women. They don't explicitly mention the sexual orientation. And so what we have is a system where we socialize people not to talk about race in particular. And what's happened is that as we began to diversify the society, Black people have said, well, things are happening to us because we're Black. Black lives matter. And so we're violating a rule. We're saying you have to talk about race. We want you to talk about race. As the curriculums around Black history and white history, because those are intertwined, become more visibly racial, it's upsetting white people because now you can't pretend that you've been fair to Black people all this time. And so what we see is a movement to try to get us back to not talking about these things. Because if we can convince people that, if we can get people not to talk about them, then we can convince them that they aren't responsible for anything that's happening to Black people or Native people or Latinx people or Asian people. Because if you don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. And so that was my take. That's always my take. How will the Supreme Court rule in a way that either makes race invisible or takes away power from racial groups? How will the Supreme Court rule in ways that takes away power from LGBTQ plus people? How will it rule in a way that takes away power from gender? How will it rule in a way that takes away power from religions other than Christianity? And so as we look at their rulings, you can predict in advance exactly what will happen. It will move us back to the way that it was before. It will move us away from talking about them. It will move us away from acknowledging the disenfranchisement or the marginalization of these groups. So I always look at it as, well, I'll be surprised if they make another decision that is contrary to what I believe. But except for one voting rights decision that they made, for the most part, they have ruled in a way that's consistent with the previous history of how the country was founded.
So there's some intentionality, certainly, and some connectivity to, I think, many of the news headlines that we've been watching, both in terms of looking at the state level at banning curriculum in schools, right? Sort of access to information, as you noted, which it is interesting. So if I go back to your point of sort of bringing things back to the way that they used to be, I can recall being in conversations more recently when, legislation to ban certain books in particular was being proposed, and folks were saying this is going to be harmful because it, sort of takes away something. And I remember saying, well, let's think about that, because I'm not sure that public schools in particular ever really were in a place where they were inclusive in terms of, curriculum, as well as in terms of the experiences of students in public schools. We were certainly attempting to make our way there. So we know that there were things like culturally responsive pedagogy or sort of racially conscious, pedagogy that were being introduced. But it feels like, right, as those things were potentially making some movement and progress, the pendulum, right, or at least the forced movement of the pendulum in the other direction seems to be what we're dealing with now. What I'm struck by is the seeming inability of folks to connect those dots, to really sort of understand what you've highlighted. I'm wondering if you can say more, especially about power and privilege as it pertains to white heterosexual male privilege, but sort of the connection between what we're seeing at the state level and the Supreme Court and just other efforts to really, as you said, bring things back to the way that they were.
Well, I think what we don't acknowledge the extent to which our governmental structures are traditionally governed by white heterosexual men with power and privilege. And so they want to maintain their power to the extent that they have power. They want to maintain it. So what we're seeing, however, is that as primarily white women, but also people of color begin to become more visible in the legislative system, it's a threat, very much as it was in the early Jim Crow days. And so when people of color or marginalized identities gain power, the way white heterosexual men with power see it is that that's a threat to them. And so what they do is they shut down those systems. But the way they hide it from us is that it looks like there are different issues. So when there was the anti-abortion ruling, it looked like that was a different issue than, say, the affirmative action ruling. But in fact, those are intersecting issues because they all deal with issues that were a threat to white heterosexual male privilege. If we look at the LGBTQ plus laws that are essentially going against them, it's because they're threatening the heterosexuality of white males, which they see as a threat to their power. And so everything is connected. And I almost, well, I did, but no one would publish it, wrote about how when the issues were about voting rights and Black people, Latinx people, um, white women, and for that matter, LGBTQ people did not see those as their issues. And so they did not support them. And what that meant then is that we had this separation. White women were living their lives and people of color were saying we need our rights. But now that they've done something that really threatens white women, they are beginning to see that that's their issue. But I don't know if they're saying that it's connected to the issue of affirmative action or LGBTQ plus rights. And so what I'm hoping is that people will begin to think about this not as just threats to individual groups, but they will see that this is a system shutting down on people because the people at the top want to keep all of the power. There's no reason why they should have all the power, other than that's the way it was originally written in the Constitution. But times have changed. There's diversity. And so we need to be able to say to them that we are united in wanting to get power, even if I can't see immediately how this power affects me. If it's different from being white heterosexual male with power and privilege, then I need to support it because if I don't, then I'm supporting a threat to my being as well.
I am curious what you would say to, when I say younger generations, I mean, I think generations even younger than myself who either haven't read, haven't been exposed to, or don't quite understand some of the history that you're putting on the table for us in terms of, the Constitution and what was originally there and the implications, and just thinking about the current rulings. I'm not sure that younger generations are also able to understand the gravity of what the Supreme Court rulings mean as it pertains to racial justice. And I know that we started our conversation thinking about racial injustice. So how can you help us, I think, better understand or maybe frame the understanding from a perspective of racial injustice?
That's kind of difficult because in some sense, that's a question for their parents because they may not have done what they needed to do to help them understand this.
Yeah.
And so now it's a matter of, can we backtrack and make them see what's happening? And so it occurred to me that, for instance, certainly college-age students would understand that the loans that they are now carrying and trying to pay off, that the Supreme Court said Biden could not pay off for them, that's the Supreme Court exercising its power over them. And so if it can do that with respect to that issue, it can do that with respect to everything in their lives that they think is important. And so they need to get involved in learning about how the system wants to threaten them. Why does the system want to take away the opportunity to have their loans paid off? Well, no one ever said that Black people were entitled to an education. In fact, the history is that we were not entitled to an education. And we have not been entitled to an education that involved white people longer than 1954, which Brown versus Topeka, which, if you think about it, is not a very long time in the history of the United States. And that was just a theoretical integration. And so what we see in the Supreme Court is that the next thing is that they are going to try to overturn Brown versus Topeka, because that's what integrated the schools. And so Black people, Black young people, need to learn how to play racism chess, which is what's the next move going to be, and what's going to be our backup strategy if in fact that happens. So as Black people, we've always had to operate on two spaces. One is getting the credentials to do what we needed to do, but the other is to understanding how the system is working to keep us from doing that. I think the Black people, young people of today, may have learned how to get the credentials. They haven't learned the skills of recognizing how the system is going to try to keep them from using those credentials. And so that kind of has to be the message that we are continually communicating to them, asking them about, challenging them to think about, and showing them ways in which it's meaningful to their lives. Because right now, I'm afraid they don't understand how it has meaning in their lives.